So our next panel, where we're going to be indeed talking about whether we need a new global financial architecture. This panel, the answer will probably be a resounding yes. So I think we're going to talk about what that should look like specifically. And so joining me is Dr. James Mwangi. He's the CEO of Equity Group. We have Sara, also Dr. Sara Pantuliano, right? If you want the, who's the chief executive of ODI. Still counts. Hannah Ryder, who's the CEO of Development Reimagined, and Dedo Baranshamaje. Yes, okay, practicing that one. The director of strategy for the Segal Family Foundation. So thank you all for being here. I am hoping that you guys are all going to bring the energy, because I know people are probably flagging a little bit, but this is in our briefing call, like this is a pretty powerhouse group, and I think they're going to share with you some pretty great opinions. So where I wanted to start is really looking at this question of what is broken in our current global financial architecture. I think to start to talk about what solutions we need, we first need to identify the problems. So I'm going to actually throw that to the group of you, and I don't know who wants to sort of start. Dedo, do you want to kick us off? But let's start by identifying the problems, the challenges that we're facing, and why the system needs to be changed.
Happy to get started, but I wanted us to say thank you to Devex for hosting this conversation in the busiest week in New York, which shows the magnitude of the Bretton Woods agreement, where this conversation is really shattering this idea of financial institutions that are global. I don't know necessarily if I can name what is broken, but I will share a few stories. This week, when I was trying to figure out how to answer to this question, I asked some of our partners who are in New York with us. You know, by the way, Segal Family Foundation provides funding to local organizations across Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them have worked for these institutions. So when I was trying to wrap my head around this topic, here are the few things that I heard. One was that, yes, we need a new global financing architecture since 20 years ago, if not since the beginning. And others say that, yes, we could start talking about a new global financing architecture, but if we're not talking about new values that are going to lead the world to solve the problems around inclusivity, solve the problems of and the needs of the developing countries, we might be doing simple tweaks to a bigger problem. So I think what is broken in a nutshell is, one, how do we shift the attention around the polarization that we have currently between the West and the rest of the world, which these global institutions have played a key role. It would be too arrogant for me to talk about what is broken, but I think at the core of it is starting to figure out how do we bring the voices of the people that our current social and global financing scheme have left out, and including parts of Africa.
I think what we have to remember as well is, number one, that, and put very simply, this is a global financial system that was created at a time when the predominant economic model, global economic model, was one of colonialism. So when the Bretton Woods institutions were formed, obviously many African countries were still not independent. 3 of the 44 founding members were African, that's Ethiopia, Egypt, and apartheid South Africa. And so it's no real surprise that that financial system that was built on a extractive, exploitative economic model has not really created significant change. If you look at the current wealth distribution between, let's say, the African continent and the rest of the world, not much has changed over time. If anything, it's kind of declined. So with that, I think it gives a clearest story as to why things need to change. 80 years later, which will be next year, this is something we need to change and make it based on a model which is based on growth for everybody, as opposed to colonization and exploitation.
So since we're going in order, carry on. I think Hannah and Dedo are putting a really important point on the table, because a lot of the discussion at the moment is around some of the technical fixes. And so there is a lot of focus on, some of the processes that we've had around the capital adequacy framework, around the cost of borrowing, around,
For people who maybe don't know all the proposals that are sort of out there, do you want to give us a little breakdown of what does the capital adequacy framework?
It's all about leveraging the resources that, the IFIs already have. It's about, not doing more with the money that they have, basically pricing the risk differently, making sure that they can use, the resources without going back to shareholders for more money. That means that, there's a lot of emphasis on the AAA rating, which is really important for the banks, because they feel that is gives them the credibility, to do their transactions. But actually, it's not really needed in some ways. That's not what those institutions were created for. They're not commercial banks. They don't really need to be judged like a commercial bank. They're supposed to be there to support, development in enterprises. And so, if you actually, just went for a AA or sort of for a slightly lower rating, you would leverage a lot more resources.
They would argue that the cost of borrowing would then go up for them, and that would have to be passed on.
Well, I think there's been a lot. Anyways, there's
argument.
been a lot of this, sort of analysis done that demonstrates that that's not the case. But to go back to the point, we focusing a lot on some technical fixes, tinkering around the edges of the problem, rather than looking at what is fundamentally broken and how you rebuild in a way that really goes to Dedo's and Hannah's point. That means that the countries that are borrowing at the moment, who are so dissatisfied by how the IFIs are sort of engaging with them, really have a voice, which is what the G20 is really trying to do, to bring to the table. But they are limited because there isn't a space for a deeper, more fundamental reform.
James, you bring a bit of a different perspective because you run quite a large regional bank in Africa. And so I'm curious, and you do work with some of the IFIs. And so I'm curious your take on, what's not working in the system. How could these institutions better empower local banks, local financial systems? Because ultimately what we're talking about here is reforming a broader system to empower local actors, to build better local markets that's going to lift people out of poverty and help address climate change and all these things. So I'm curious your perspective.
Thank you very much. And it's a really privilege to be here. I think a lot of arguments have been advanced as to why the global financial system is broken. The first one is that the environment is very dynamic. And unfortunately, the financial system have not been responsive to the dynamic. The real need for the world at the moment is climate financing. But there is no flows to that class of assets or that space. So the system has remained supply-driven as opposed to demand-driven. So the two are not connecting. The demand and the supply are not speaking to each other, or they are speaking cross purposes. The second aspect is the issue of emerging markets, developing countries. And I think the hue and cry is about equity. Today, President Ruto on stage said Kenya pays between 5 and 8 times what other countries are paying. And the question is this an equitable system? And his basis of argument is the risk framework seems to be broken. How risk is evaluated, how risk is priced seems to be handicapping countries. And lastly, is that the system is not inclusive. The majority of the countries are not able to get finance, and if they get, not what they are looking for, and not for the period they are looking for, and not for their development priorities. So when you look at all those, then the conclusion is this is a broken system that needs to be revisited and transformed to be relevant to the needs of today's world.
So, Sara, you said that a lot of the current proposals on the table are sort of tinkering around the edges, right? It's been very focused on sort of the World Bank and other MDBs. So how do you maximize your balance sheets? All of these things, which are, technical financial things, which, okay, they might unlock some more billions of dollars, but not the type of scale, and not, to Hannah and Dedo's point, not really changing the power dynamic of how these flows are driven and who is driving that. So if we start to think then about what are the solutions, what would a better system look like? I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And the politics here are hard, right? Because right now shareholders have the power, and it is in fact their money, and so they believe they should have a power in determining how it's spent. And so getting them to agree to a change may be hard, but maybe not. Sara thinks there's room.
Before we get to what the system should be like, I hear a lot about the shareholders, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. There's a lot of blaming of the shareholders. I see a lot of resistance within the institutions. I have said famously in a talk to the Staff Association of the World Bank a couple of years ago that the problem for me was more the permafrost, as I call it, of these institutions. Basically, executives have been there for a very long time. And even if you have an inspired leadership or, inspired sort of more younger staff, don't want to change things, and where the incentives are all about doing bigger deals with lower risk, because that's what careers are judged on. And so to me, that is much more fundamental to address than, of course, the shareholders is important, but there is a lot of that inertia and reluctance internally. Take DFC as an example. DFC is an interesting, really innovative opportunity because they don't borrow from the capital market. They could use, in a way, their capital in a much more if you want, risk-taking way, but they're not, because the majority of the people that work for DFC come from the experience of OPIC. They're people that were used to try and maximize the return on investment, and so that is what drives the behavior. So I'm not sure. I don't know what you think, but I think the shareholders.
I think you bring up a really good point, because I think in so many of these cases, particularly where you're talking about DFIs and IFIs who are investing sort of private capital, is the compensation structures, right? And we're not seeing a willingness. I have put this question to a lot of the leaders. I've asked Mokhtar Diop, but I have seen this pretty recently. But most of them are not willing to sort of talk about how do you make impact targeting low-income markets part of a compensation structure, not just making it about the number of deals and the number of dollars out the door. I do think that the Inter-American Development Bank is looking at ways to actually incorporate impact in their compensation structure, but we'll see.
Yeah, but and it also goes beyond that. I think, one thing I've talked about, for example, is increasing diversity within organizations, not only, diversity of people, but even thinking. The economic models that are used, whether it's discount rates, whether it's debt sustainability analysis, etc., all sit into a very traditional box. And again, these have been there for a very, very long time. When they are changed, they're changed with very small tweaks. And therefore, they preserve the same things, the outcomes around risk. Africa risk, you can't divorce that from the debt sustainability framework that is provided from the IMF and the World Bank. These are fundamental aspects of how the IFIs do their business that do need to be changed. And I think there are several proposals for changing those, but fundamentally it's really about, as you were saying, making the system more borrower-oriented as opposed to creditor-oriented. And that is, it's going to take so many different changes. One change that we have talked about, and one proposal that we have as a firm, is a borrowers club, and you can think of that as a spectrum. The spectrum on the kind of very simple side is having borrowers work together to exchange information, for example, about what did they get best from this creditor, what kind of deals did they get, etc., and how can they all improve. On the other end, you could have an actual new financial instrument which would be based in the same kind of idea that remember Grameen? I mean, we're all development experts, right? So we know the Grameen Bank, microfinance, really brought finance to the unbanked, right? Villages in the unbanked. You could have a very similar system where you pool finance at the sovereign level and therefore give out finance. A very different way of operating an international financial institution, but certainly could be done. And again, it's these sorts of ideas, I think, that need to be coming to the fore, being discussed by the IFIs, piloting, et cetera, et cetera.
Dedo, I'm curious your perspective sort of on this power shift and also on how this sort of geopolitics of this moment is impacting this conversation, because it makes it only more complicated.
I'm glad you asked, because what I'm realizing and then have been hearing for the last 4 days in New York is how all these conversations are structured around the World Bank, IMF, and the same traditional institutions. But where I'm from and where I work most of the time across Africa, the conversation has changed. These institutions are not seen as having the best interests of people. They have seen them for a very long time being instruments of the Western hegemony, led with interventionism and led with giving moral lessons that they do not follow themselves. But where conversation have moved is particularly around, if we take an example of what is happening in West Africa, you're starting to see a dissatisfaction around how the global politics have been shaped and the power dynamics around countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and others, and their relationship with France, when they're saying, why do we have to continue to listen to a country that has continued to undermine our rights and countries that have continued to not have our best interests at heart when we're talking about exchange of their minerals? Andrew Steer talked about this very well. These are countries that have extremely wealthy minerals and that are not getting the fair share of their the price of their minerals. And when they're saying, how do you justify that that our continent is still poor when we are the richest in terms of resource? How do you justify that we continue to trade in a currency that is backed by gold by countries that don't have gold? You know what I mean? In terms of power dynamics, we have to start putting at the center some of these realities that we have forgotten and challenge a little bit some of the old narratives that have shaped the current global financing infrastructure that we have, to start putting at the center new values around mutuality and shared humanity and respect and fair exchange. And I think if we're talking about these new global institutions, this is going to be at the center of it. How do we challenge power dynamics? How do we build new values that are about shared humanity? And how do we start having much more nuanced conversation around ethical global leadership?
James, I want to come to you. I see you here smiling, so I think you maybe are agreeing with some of what you're hearing. But you're also not someone who is happy to sit and wait around for this system to change. I know you've come up with some sort of bold visions for what you want to do with equity and what you think banks and financial institutions and others on the continent can be doing to make some of these changes. And I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about that, because the change and the ideas do really have to come from the ground up. And if the system is going to be effectively changed, I think we have to look at things and listen to perspectives like yours.
What I'm hearing from my colleagues is the affirmation of the phrase, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So essentially, these institutions were created, they are political creatures. They are an outcome of the end of the Second World War. It was a new order by those who had won the war, those who wanted to get back the costs of the war, and consequently, that has run for the last 75 years. And the question people are sitting back and say, what is the relevance of this structure as it stands today? And I think, to be honest, the global financial system has been late in reforming, transforming itself, making it relevant, and understanding the times. Financial institutions' biggest responsibility is to facilitate trade. But you can see the turmoil in global trade and how, for instance, the divide allowed the world between the BRICS, and that is a real indicator of the pain, of the strain, of the discomfort. Now, for us in Africa, I agree with the African leaders. And recently, we asked the global financial institutions, you have been investing in Africa for the last 60 years. Share with us the development plan that you have been implementing over the last 60 years. Unfortunately, there is no plan. It has been ad hoc investment. Failure to plan is planning to fail. And no wonder the investment has not made any meaningful contribution to Africa. So we were bold and said, as Africans, why don't we develop the African Development Plan? And then consult these institutions, sit with them and say, if you don't agree with us, give us an alternative. And I'm glad that eventually we came up with the African Recovery and Resilience Plan and said, everybody who wants to finance, this is the framework of collaboration and partnership. A plan that all of us can put our hearts on. It's integrated, it's coordinated, and is driven by the aspirations and the needs of the borrower. So you can see the challenges that has been there. They are fundamental. And so time for the reforms is with us.
Yeah. So we have not that much time left, but I want to talk about, to close, get each of your perspectives on sort of what tangible things can be done to change the system. Look, I talked to Karsten a little bit about what's happening on tax, where we have seen African nations make a push and actually successfully get a resolution passed at the UN. And some of those conversations are starting to happen. We saw a report from the Secretary General. There's some movement there. There's certainly a need on debt to figure out a better way, because the current G20 mechanisms are not working very well and certainly very slowly. And so I'm curious your thoughts on what sort of steps can be taken to change. A lot of what we talked about is really big change, but you've got to start somewhere. You've got to take some steps along that journey to get things moving. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll kick off. So one, I think, just to really very quickly on debt, we need to remember that the African continent's overall external debt is about less than 2% of global external debt, right? So the idea that debt and dealing with debt of a country like Zambia or Kenya or whatever is a massive issue for the world, I think we really need to be very, very careful about how that is actually, the reality is that's not really the true. So I think
a massive issue for those countries.
For those countries, of course, Zambia's taxpayers, earn just over $1,000 a month. US taxpayers earn over 70,000 on average. So, there are some significant differences in being able to deal with these issues. So, but in any case, just in terms of solutions, I think I've talked about Borrowers Club, but I think there's things like special drawing rights being reallocated into the African Development Bank is one which we've been talking about for over 2 years now, not actually been done, and the African Development Bank doing a lot of work on that. And they are at the forefront. African financial institutions are really at the forefront of doing a lot for the continent and doing it very well. And in addition, I would say working on an African monetary fund is also another one which would deal with some of these issues that we've talked about with regards to the franc and so on, and currency would also be another idea that needs to be pushed.
I think there are, in addition to what Hannah has mentioned, there is a number of big issues there that are a problem, from the borrower's perspective. And a really key one is the lending in hard currency, because when it comes to debt, that's the first thing to really push, because that risk needs to be absorbed by some of the lending institutions. They can use that by blending in a different way, by using some of the other in a way that actually takes that risk away, takes that cost from the countries that borrow. That's a political decision, quite frankly. It's not technical. It's something that shareholders others can decide, to do. There are other things about, de-risking private investment that can be done. Again, I mean, that's what we want. We want to create more jobs, better trade in Africa. That will need, the private capital to come in. But there are a lot of, perceived regulatory barriers, but actually the more, sort of behavioral issues than real regulatory barriers around, the type of investment, how you can invest a pension fund or, insurance, that they're sort of self-imposed, but they're not really that. It's about educating, the investors, educating, the regulators. Those are all things that can be done, quite easily and will be fairly fundamentals. It's about, sort of different DFIs, IFIs coming together to share the risk, creating co-financing platforms. That will also reduce the cost of borrowing, will make it a lot more affordable. Fundamentally, to me, it's starting with the incentives I was talking about. A lot of these things are possible if the institutions really focus, to changing what the reward in terms of success internal. Because if people don't feel it's worth, doing deals are smaller, they can, sort of really support African investors, or, that there are too risky, or, in countries that are too, sort of volatile, then nothing is going to change.
If I jump in, and 2 cents maybe advice to these institutions, as in the private sector, succeed because of listening to the market and being market driven. I think the global financial system needs to listen to its clients, who includes the developing world. The second aspect has been brought out very strongly by a colleague about equity. If Africa is 20% of the land mass of the world, why get 2% of total financing? If Africa has 40% of the strategic green minerals which can solve the issue of climate change, why allocate it 2% when its raw material is 40%? If Africa has 65% of a neutralized arable land that requires investment, why allocate it 2% when it has 65% of the raw material? The issue of equity, and by extension fairness, needs to be revisited.
And so are there instruments that you think can be created to do that? I mean, you talked about foreign, the foreign exchange risk. Does that help an institution like yours do more? Does it help other African institutions grow to create that local market so that you start to solve in the long term some of these challenges? You have more local currency lending, you're less reliant on outside flows, and you can create a better market system.
It is true. If you look at Kenya, when it relied on the financial commercials of a banking system, only 4% of the entire population had access to financial services. Come in local financial institutions, playing on the same rules, same regulation, 90% of the population has bank accounts. Make the systems relevant to the entire world. It's a skewed system designed to create success and failure. You can't have such a system in a marketplace. A marketplace system needs to be fair and objective. And that is why risk could be measured fairly and objectively, so that you qualify based on your needs and your capability to repay, but not by a designed system.
Dedo, do you have some final words to close us off?
I think if we pick one or two of the suggestions my colleague made, we are in a better shape. But I was going to say that there's a much more fractured and nuanced conversation to be had beyond lending and borrowing. We're talking about now consensus around on which currency. You have countries across Africa now that are saying, why do we need to transact using the dollar between Kenya and Eritrea, where we could have our own currency? So I think we could bring the conversation closer to what does it take to build safety and reduce the inequities that we have. And I think it's going to require much more blended financing schemes where we pick lessons from DFIs and philanthropy and investments that we have seen in the past, and to center that around people and values that we want to see in the world.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for this great conversation. I think you've given everyone a lot of food for thought, and maybe you've got some converts to the fight to make a difference and push forward some of these proposals. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.